Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined again today by my collaborator, co-conspirator, and research director of the Texas Politics Project. Not in that order, of course. Joshua Blank. Josh, good morning.
Good morning.
So on last week's podcast, Josh and I were joined by the illustrious Professor Darren Shaw. I used all of his titles last time. I will not do that this time.
I got the title treatment this time.
You got the title treatment with in the absence of Professor Shaw.
Yeah, I only heard conspirator. But
So last week, Darren was here so we could do a rollout podcast pegged to the release of our latest UT Texas Politics Project poll, which we conducted in mid to late February. Yeah, that last conversation, and this happens when we have Darren, and it's it's reasonably on purpose. We sort of migrated a lot into national politics or kind of electoral politics to some degree, and that, of course, is Professor Shaw's bread and butter. I bet he doesn't eat a lot of bread and butter, though.
No,
that guy,
he's
pretty
fit,
lean.
He's fit, yeah.
This week, we want to drill down into one subject that we touched on towards the end last week, and it came up in a couple of small points, but we're definitely saving it for later, and that subject would be public education. Now, like I said, we plumbed that a little bit last week, and we've been talking about it. But the other thing that was interesting about public education in terms of the approach in the poll was that, as I think we said, we talked about a little bit last week, but it's worth reiterating as people look at the data. We didn't want to get ahead of where the conversation was in a lot of these subject areas. I mean, there were a lot of bills floating around out there, most of which are not going to move.
Right.
Public education, a little bit different than that. I mean, we still don't know, as we'll get into today, exactly what's going to happen by a long shot. But because public education is such a perennial issue, because it's so big,
Yep.
we know we have a little bit more of an idea of what's out there, and that's reflected in the instrument. So in the instrument, we gave people a list of about 10 possible subjects, I think.
I think that's right.
Of policy and it wasn't even just subjects of policy. It was also, there was a little bit of perspective. Some of it was a little bit of a kind of a subject check in terms of we had parental rights on the list. Yeah. Now, parental rights is not a specific topic area, but it's certainly an area that has some salience to certainly players in the system and also out in the world, in the public, as we saw. And so we did do a little bit more on public ed this time, right? So let's start with the general assessment. So we know that, public education comes up a lot. It's a perennial subject. It's big. It's a big budget item. It's salient. But you've been looking back at some of the data on this, in the long term of the poll and have some nuance in terms of when it's come up, how it's not, et cetera, right?
Right. I'm trying to develop some nuance. And this is the beginning of some of that.
This is the pre-nuance.
This is the pre-nuance meeting, right? Okay. So, that's right. Public education is probably one thing you didn't mention in terms of just sort of why it's kind of always on the agenda is also, somebody's always talking about it. And it may be somebody in the position to put it directly on the agenda, or it may be dissidents in either party or, even the opposition party or whatever, just saying, hey, look.
And certainly the interest group community.
The interest group community is always
looms very large.
Always activated. There are some pretty large educational interest institutions with very close proximity to the Capitol, right?
Yes.
So ultimately, it's always an agenda item, but the prominence of it changes over time, and we'll kind of get around to this, I think, at the end in some way, because its salience changes over time. There's always a core group of people. In some ways, education is kind of like healthcare. Healthcare always comes up in a poll as one of the most important problems facing the country, facing the state. There's a core group of voters who are always going to say healthcare is a major issue. I'm not saying they're the same voters every time.
And the size, and it's perennial but not consistent in its in the magnitude of that interest.
Well, I'll say it's not. the magnitude of that interest doesn't vary a lot, though, in the sense that it's usually less than 10% of voters. And that's generally pretty true with education also. Usually less than 10% of voters are going to prioritize education as a major issue unless there's a reason for it to prioritize. For example, the 2011 education cuts, right? The big cuts to education after that financial crisis and, some misestimation about state revenue, et cetera, et cetera.
Misunderestimation. I think it's the definitional moment of misunderestimation by the controller at that time.
Well, it's a funny thing, going back through the point, it's surprising how often we ask people whether they knew who the controller was back in that period.
Right.
But again, it was a thing. So at that point in time, education, we would ask sort of in a list of priorities, right? When we're talking about, what should the legislature focus on? And again, at the beginning of each session, we essentially ask a priority question. In the past, we've done something kind of closed-ended that reflects what the conversation was. More recently, we've gone to open-ended questions to let people tell us what they think the legislature should focus on.
Although not that we want to stop doing that, as long as we're rangy in our podcast.
Yeah, no.
It is interesting that those open-endeds are not too far off of what the closed-ended lists yield us.
No, I mean,
if you compare it to like the MIP or it's not exactly the same, and it's worth doing, but it is kind of interesting.
Well, look, I'll just say there's some validity in it, and like when you look back in time, you see a much greater prominence among Republicans for like limiting spending, concerned about the debt, and then you kind of see that over time kind of fall aside, and and that's been reflected in the conversations. I just think,
and the composition and tone of the party,
right? So but the main point is we always see public education as one of the main priorities that people think the legislature should take on, and the tone and the context of that changes. So after 2011, 2013, 2015, we're talking about restoring the cuts to education. Then there's sort of the question in 2015, well, is it enough just to restore the cuts? Do you have to put in more money than you had in before, right? And generally this led to, and again, like this, you imagine the politics of this led to a discussion that was like, well, wait a minute, is this really about money? Right?
Yeah.
And so then, we get a much more attention to public ed financing in 2017, leading into the 2019 session in which they really take on public ed financing coupled with property tax reduction, a very comfortable space to be in, right? But then after that, you'd say it kind of drops off the main agenda to some extent. In 2021, you've got COVID, you've got the grid collapse, you've got election legislation, after sort of all this action was taken in 2019, right? So all of this takes place, right? This is sort of the arc we're kind of going on getting to this point. It takes place in, really generally lukewarm at best overall evaluations of the quality of the public education system, which I think as a public opinion person is interested in all this. What we should focus on kind of shifts over time, kind of shifts around. We'll talk about why maybe, some of these financing things are maybe more salient than some of these other things. But then when we say, well, hey, how would you rate the public ed system? We've asked this, I think, it looks like at least, 10 or 12 times since 2013. And at no point has more than 1 in 10 voters said that the system's excellent.
Right.
And generally it looks more like 1 in 20. The plurality response is that it's good, right? But there's more people who say it's not very good or terrible than usually say that it's good. And so, it's sort of this interesting kind of overall dynamic.
And they don't move, and those numbers just don't move very much over time.
No, they don't move very much over time. Now, I should say this. There is something that's important to establish here, which is that we're asking about assessments of the system as a whole. When we ask parents specifically about their kids' schools, the evaluations almost always go up significantly. So if I say, and that's again, even if I say to a parent, how do you think the public school system in Texas is? Again, very few are going to say it's excellent. How is your kid's school? Oh, it's excellent. Teachers are great. We love it.
Right. For
the most part. Now, look, there's some data that indicates that that's been, changing potentially a little bit over time, but not a ton. So,
well, I think that, just a stray comment on the overall kind of, the fat part of that distribution. And again, we would expect this. Yeah. We asked that question. We say, is it excellent, good, not very good, terrible?
Right.
Right. And, the numbers for good and not very good are remarkably stable and account for, three quarters consistently throughout this time series, between 7 and 8 of 10. But as I'm sitting here, it reminds me of, and I think her thinking has changed on this, and I don't want to hold her to this. And if she hears this, she can call me and come on the show. But Erica Greeter's book, Red Hot and Cheap.
No,
isn't that right?
Yeah.
Now I think that's about.
I think right is in the title too.
Yeah, maybe so.
And right. It's and right, right?
Well, I don't know.
think the right's
I think it's
double
just red hot and cheap, but we'll look it up during the break.
Okay.
At any rate, Erica's book on Texas, I mean, in some ways she made the argument that, yeah, the Texas schools were not terrible. They weren't great. And that's probably about where the median point was for that the public was fairly satisfied with that. These numbers sort of weigh that argument out. I mean, there are other ways one might, quibble with that argument, but it's kind of there. So what is that book?
It's Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right, What America Can Learn from the Strange Genius of Texas. I'm sure you can get it in any of your favorite booksellers.
Yes.
Barnes & Noble, Amazon.
Had a red cover anyway.
It had a red cover, yes.
Okay, good.
I knew the right did two things on that.
Good real-time fact-checking on Erica Greeter's book. And Erica's now a columnist for the Houston Chronicle if you want to look Erica's stuff up. And so I think, that's an interesting piece of this. So let's then talk about spending, since that's kind of underlying this. And so in this last poll, we asked a battery of questions where we asked people to evaluate whether the state was spending too much, too little, or about the right amount on, I think on this thing, it was about a dozen issue areas. And so we have two results from that, because we have everybody assess it individually, and then we have a top. Do we have a top priority? No, we don't have a top priority on this one. So that's why it was so hard to present this graphically. So we have all these comparative kind of standards of how much people should spend, and the spending results on education were, I think, revealing to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
And this was K through 12 public education was the wording.
Right, and the idea with a question like this is not because we think people have, some sense of like the distribution of the last budget cycle or anything like that. That's not the idea.
In fact, it's because we assume they don't.
Yeah, we assume they don't. But the idea here is this is really about, your perception of state investment in the areas. Are they doing enough? Are they not doing enough? Right?
Yeah.
Or are they doing the right amount? And that's the idea here. And so, and again, this is sort of, this is a reasonable way to ask people about budgetary priorities, right, to get these perceptions.
Yeah, that respects the fact that large numbers don't really mean anything to people.
Right, and so there's just the question of this perception. And again, this is important because we're talking about politics, right? Yeah. So perceptions matter. So overall, when we ask this question, only 12% of Texans think that we're spending too much on K through 12 public education. Almost half, 48%, say we're spending too little, with about a third saying about the right amount and 12% saying, I have no idea, right? But the main point is about half say we're spending too little on public ed. Now, not surprisingly, it's driven to some extent, though not entirely, by Democrats. So 71% of Democrats say we're spending too little on education, compared to 27% of Republicans. It's not as though Republicans overall think we're spending too much on public education. Only 17% do. Most, the plurality, 42%, think we're spending about the right amount, which is, I should say, pretty common Republican response to the spending items. It's a pretty safe place to be if you're basically happy with the direction of government, the distribution of resources. You say, yeah, this is about right. Then when we look at it compared to everything else, what we basically find is K through 12 public education in the middle of the pack. Of those 12 items, in terms of where Texans think we're spending too little. So the thing that, what topped the list, mental health services. And this is consistent. This is bipartisan, right? Not surprising. It attaches to a lot of different issues, actually.
Yeah.
Electric infrastructure was next. Again, that's mostly driven by Democrats, but actually there's a lot of Republicans who are, I think, not uninterested.
Yeah, a little more conscious of keeping the lights on than they might have been 5 years ago.
Yeah, and I should say, to the main point here, there's an extent to which the too little responses are going to be driven by Democrats who overwhelmingly see the state as spending too little on most of these issues. So it's going to reflect Democratic priorities, right? Healthcare comes next, for example, but then water infrastructure, then children in the state's care, which is a pretty, big issue area if you've been following it. And it's good that at least, there's a fair number of people who kind of see that. And then K through 12 public education comes in the middle. It's only higher than the environment, transportation. I'm going to put a pin in border security for a second.
Yeah.
Higher ed, broadband access, which is interesting. I'll say, there's I think a bill released the other day talking, talk of a lot of significant investments in broadband access. And broadband access,
there was a broadband and a water bill dropped this week.
Right, and broadband access is kind of down the list.
House, on the House side, we should say.
Right, and at the very bottom is prisons. So, K through 12 public education, kind of in the middle, definitely driven mostly by Democrats, but not something that people are necessarily, and I'll say the Republicans are necessarily saying, oh, you need to put money into the system right now.
Yeah, not to overinterpret the data, which we're always advising people not to do. But I find that 42% of Republicans saying we're spending about the right amount pretty significant. As we have this multifaceted, to broaden the discussion where we're kind of heading today, is we have this multifaceted conversation about public education. To the extent that spending is a part of that, given the money that is out there available, given the budget surplus, you're just not going to find a lot of takers among Republicans for the argument that, okay, we also need to, increase spending on public ed. And this, this is not news. I mean, there's a common conservative argument that, public school problems in part, and this is more traditional, we're in a kind of a new twist that we'll talk about in a minute, but traditionally there has been an argument that the problems in public schools are not about the amount of money, it's about how it's spent.
Right.
You can, for those of you on Twitter, I mean, it is a common trope for, particularly, just to be fair, public school funding out, voucher type advocates or, critics of the public schools, to remind people that there are overpaid superintendents and, too many facilities and, too many, thumb twiddling administrators, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not surprising, but I think it is worth noting that there is a receptive public audience for those arguments. Again, we get into the, chicken egg issue here, but
and you know what? And the thing
it's
is,
out there.
Well, and there's a better avenue, which is property tax reduction. So if you are, a Republican legislator and you want to put more money into the public education system, in some ways you get a twofer if you go and actually lower property taxes,
right?
And then basically, at the very least commit to making that up in the overall funding formulas on the state side, right? And then you get to say, not only did I lower property taxes, but I increased funding to your public school system, which again, not really going to hurt you in most cases.
Right.
But to your point, I mean, we've asked about this before. And I mean, the share of Democrats who see increasing funding in the system as being an effective way to improve the system is significantly higher than the share of Republicans who agree with that. And so that's kind of important to address, especially in the context of kind of some of the big issues. And I guess we move to that next, which is sort of what's important. And the two things that top the list as sort of most important in terms of for the legislature to address in K through 12 public education was number one, school safety, number two, teacher pay and retention. And so it's interesting because on the one hand, you've got teacher pay and retention pretty high up the list. Pretty far down the list is public school financing at this point, which again used to be, if it were 2015, 2016, that might be a lot higher, right? But now we're talking about this, but it's weird to kind of decouple those things, right?
Right, exactly. And and just to flesh out that list, to get where we're going, I mean, to set up before we break it down into party, we'll give kind of spoiler alert. So, the top item, as you said, was school safety at 29%. Second was teacher pay, teacher retention at 21%. Third was something that we explained to the respondents as curriculum content, that is what students are taught. And then ninth, as I sort of foreshadowed, was the fourth with 9% was parental rights. Right. And then given the conversation, we should say, then the fifth response was vouchers, educational savings accounts, or other school choice legislation, and we phrased it that way, at 8%. And then you break that up, and the partisan structure looks very familiar to what we're seeing right now, right?
Right, where basically, about 2/3 of Democrats would prioritize school safety or teacher pay, almost pretty much even proportions. And so that generates, most of the Democratic response, with curriculum content coming in a close third. Now, again, what Democrats mean by curriculum content and what Republicans mean by curriculum content likely means different things.
Right.
But you would say the fat part of, the Democratic Party on this is on school safety and teacher pay. And I would say if school safety weren't so salient right now because of Uvalde,
right.
Teacher pay would be dominating that list.
Right. And I think, it's interesting to step back for a second, to go back to, you sort of, I think you flagged this to come back to, and we should just come back to it now, which is if you look at the priority of school safety among both Democrats and Republicans, you look at the priority on mental health.
Right.
And not that mental health is driven entirely by the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting, but, all our polling or the extensive polling that we've done on gun safety and particularly on school shootings suggests that, a lot of Texans of both parties think that mental health is a big part of the explanation for those kinds of events. And it is, interesting to note how much that is rippling through these preferences without us saying, hey, in the context of the school shooting, what do you think? Right. We didn't contextualize either of the questions that we got these responses on. They were more general questions. And it is interesting to see that diffusion of the impact of the shooting that is consistent with some of the immediate polling we did that saw these as, areas where there was bipartisan, some bipartisan interest, or the attitudes were not night and day like they are on another, to my mind, equally obvious part of the explanation, which is gun safety.
Right. And this is why we did this the way we did it. Right. I mean, to your point, you've gone through the list of how we kind of laid out these priorities. And the point is, I say this is like, the term of the day, I guess. Think about levels of conceptualization. We're talking about broad issue areas that might be important.
Right.
We're not saying a law that would do X, a law that would do Y, because ultimately there are no laws right now. And to your point, you said something earlier, there are probably, dozens, if not many dozens of bills that are filed right now meant to address school safety in different ways.
Yeah.
And only a couple of them are really going to move forward in any significant way.
Right. And so I think as you look at this,
so
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if we're done with the gun piece of this, let's go back to the politics of this, right? So just to go back and then move forward, right? So for Democrats, the vast majority are focused on school safety and teacher pay. I 100% agree with you. I think the way that school safety and mental health and what we know about violence attitudes, like that is a really solid cluster, again, especially for Republican leadership to operate in, because you're going to be solving the problem as viewed mostly by Republican voters, but by a large number of independents and even a significant number of Democrats in the mental health space. We look at Republicans, 1/4 say school safety should be the top priority. But, so on the one hand you say, okay, but there's a big but here, right? An equal share say curriculum content, right? And if we take curriculum content and add to that the share who say parental rights, which I think we can talk about whether that makes sense or not, we get to 42%.
Yeah.
If we add the people who say vouchers, right, now we're at 56%. And now this is sort of the question. Does that make sense, right? Should you bundle all the things together? I think you can from a politics standpoint. Yeah. From a policy standpoint, it's going to be more challenging. And this kind of comes down to this sort of the ultimate question, I think, these results bring up to me, which is, what's going to be enough for the Republican legislature to accomplish in public ed, and what kinds of things will be enough to be able to say some effective mission accomplished, or we move the ball forward significantly. And there's a challenge here. I think in all ways, curriculum content as discussed by Republicans, parental rights, and vouchers and school choice are really kind of about, in general, dissatisfaction with the way the public education system is going. The problem is that the former two are about parents who have their kids in the schools right now, and the latter is about parents who do not and don't intend to or don't want to. And those are and just from a policy standpoint, those are different things.
Yeah, I think the big question is, how, or one of the big questions for how the legislature moves forward on this and how the politics play out is how coherently those things can be stitched together. Right. Right. Does it look, I think to Democrats, it looks a little bit more like you're building a Frankenstein's monster. To Republicans, you have a little bit more potential for building this line of argument that we've been talking about. Right. And we'll come back. And I'm not forgetting about the parents, non-parents thing, the kids in the school. But I think, the argument here to me is how, in stark political terms from the legislative perspective is how successful can you be at turning what has been marketed for the most part as an argument about quote unquote school choice, which, we're not supposed to say vouchers anymore from the perspective of advocates, but school choice is still very much, the term of choice, even if it is a term of art here. How much can you move that discussion, which has not been able to gain a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, to be as concrete about it as possible? Can you take that argument, expand it with what we're seeing in these numbers by recoding education, if you will, for Republicans as about parental rights, as about not the effectiveness of the public schools, but their role, their ideological role, and their cultural role in Texas right now. And will that create enough pressure on heretofore reluctant legislators? I think, to me, that's the question in this space right now. Right. I know you want to flesh that out with it, but I mean, I think, so the argument that then comes up is, well, I mean, the argument that legislators are making, this is a little bit of a diversion here, but, I think rural legislators, if you look back at the rural numbers on public funds for private schools.
Small numbers.
They're small, but, generally it's not like the pattern in the legislature replicates itself in public opinion. And what I mean by that is, having gone back and looked at a few of these, it's never as clearly cut that rural voters are saying, oh, yeah, we don't have any choices here, so we can't,
Right.
And so, so you can see where I'm going with this. But nonetheless, the legislators have not been persuaded by that. And this is an area where, it goes back to kind of the classic formulation of representative government. Do you want me to represent exactly what you think you want, or do you want me to use my judgment to represent your interests? And in many ways, it's like the classic, Edmund Burke dilemma here. In a lot of ways, rural legislators have been acting as trustees rather than delegates, strictly speaking, if you look at at Republican public opinion, near as I recall it in looking at those rural numbers. I mean, I think I've always been a little surprised, let's see what the rural numbers on choice. Well,
yeah.
There's not rural voters are not going en masse, hey, we don't have choices here. Some are saying, yeah, that we should be able to do that. Others are not. And part of that is probably age in what's going on in these rural areas. But the pregnant question to me here is, does this recoding, I mean, I think, Governor Abbott keeps saying, this should be about, education, not indoctrination in the public schools. I've kind of been thinking about that in a slightly pivoted way, which is, we're moving from a discussion that has been keyed relatively unsuccessfully for advocates to we want to give you school choice to now we want to give you ideological and cultural choice.
Right.
Will that get them over?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing about this, to your point, I mean, I just in a response to sort of your read of the voucher support numbers, and it's one of those things where, education. This is sort of an interesting thing because there's a lot of ways we can go with this.
Yeah.
But education doesn't translate super well into public opinion because yes, I agree. I think there's a lot more ambivalence about vouchers out there in the data than I think than the legislature reflects in the way that discussion goes, right? Yeah. But this is where you kind of has to ask about salience and intensity of these opinions, right? And centrality is the other thing, right? Not only how much are you thinking about it, how intensely do you feel about it, but also how central is it to your political identity, right? In some kind of ways. And I'll say this, if you are if you work in a public school system in a rural county, it's probably a pretty big part of your identity. It might be kind of a part of the town's identity in some ways, And so for the people who care about this issue on either side, they care intensely, right? So you're talking about the employees who have a direct stake in it. You have public school parents who are ideologically committed to the system. And then you've got, again, a large community of homeschool and alternatives where people want to just send their kids to different schools, right? But nonetheless, Texas is huge. Right.
Well, and you also have another group that we have to mention, which is you don't have you're not directly interested. You either work for a school district, your livelihood is not connected, or
but that's everybody else.
Yeah, that's everyone else,
right? So I mean, I can have a kid in the public school system. In our survey, when we ask, do you have a kid in the public school system? It's about 20% of the registered voters we survey. So about 1 in 5 say they have a kid in the public school. Some infinitesimally small group of people, work in the public school systems in terms of Texas numerically.
Yes,
an even smaller numerical number of people homeschool their kids or probably take advantage of school choice options that already exist. But those people care a lot, but they are very small. And so what you end up having is you end up having survey results, let's say on vouchers, where I would say, and again, I really am so reluctant to dismiss a survey result, to say, well, these people don't they say this, but they don't, I don't think they feel
Right.
strongly about it. But in public education, I think we have precedent for this. When we go back to the public education cuts of 2011, we asked repeatedly about perceptions of quality in the system, whether there were changes, whether the funding changes mattered, all these things. And I think we wrote a blog post way back in the day about the dog that didn't bark, right? In the sense of everyone was saying, oh, you're going to hear about this, about all these public education cuts, and then ultimately people made do. They moved on, and most people, especially most voters, don't have kids in the public school system. They're not interfacing with it in any direct way, and so there is just a limit in some of this. But
well, I mean, I guess I think about it a little bit. Well, finish the thought.
Well, and I was just gonna. Well, I don't want to. I'll say where I was going to go, and then you can decide if you want to go that way or not. I was going to say. So I mean, I think it's important to think about people's interface with the system in a really fundamental way and kind of understanding what's going on here. And I think we've talked about this before, the nature of the size of House districts versus the size of state Senate districts, those kinds of things. We've gone over this on the podcast. But if we look at voters now, we can look at sort of, voters who may have, more of an interface with the system and voters who don't. We can, just by looking at age groups, right?
Yeah.
So should I go into this, or do you think?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, let's do that.
So, if we look at that the education priority by parties, we look among Republicans, let's say first, and we look at voters under 44 and those who are over 45 plus. If we look first of all at Republican voters over the age of 45, curriculum content is the number one issue, 28%. So almost 1 in 3, then school safety, then parental rights, then vouchers. If we look at the Republican voters under the age of 44, the top issue is school safety, 35%, then parental rights, then curriculum content. And so, it's a rearrangement of the thing. It's kind of their minor pieces of this, but you say, okay, that makes sense, right? And is the first thing, right? Like what is my, what do I want? Well, I want the kids to be safe because I have kids in the school. And again, I'm not saying that older voters don't want the kids to be safe, but you can have a more abstract attachment to what we're talking about here. Now, if we say, if we look just at people who actually have kids in the public schools, the first thing they say is, again, school safety and then teacher pay. And that's 55% right there of public school parents who are voters in Texas. Again, direct interface. Do they have teachers? Are they safe? Next, curriculum content. Next, parental rights, which together add up to 20%.
Right. So, to me, and, we've got, and we won't go into all the numbers, but we've also got numbers where you broke it down by, 44 and under and 45 and over. And it shows a similar pattern that makes the point. And I guess, what I was going to say, and it's good to have the data in front of us, is, the way I kind of think about this in my own kind of macro level way of thinking about these things, which one could say is, whatever, loosey-goosey, or maybe, anyway, we won't use the other adjectives. I'm not sure I'm allowed to use those words in a public institution anymore. But, if you've got this direct investment in the way that you were laying out, or this direct experiential connection with the public school system or children, or, the education is a process, you're going to have a different affect and a different set of priorities, a different, however you attitudinal response, than if it's more abstract and there are other things filling it in. And what I was going to jump in and say is so if you don't have that direct connection, then the question is, what else fills in that attitudinal space when somebody says, hey, what do you think about this? Right? And if you're not thinking, and I think this really illustrates that, and look, the population, Republicans now have a lot of other material that has been that has been directly articulated by opinion leaders and elected officials and, partisan media, frankly.
Right.
That says, hey, here's a bunch of information, or here's a bunch of ways of framing public education that makes sense to them. And that's why we're seeing that, curriculum content, parental rights, these, and then, once you put those two things in the hopper, maybe what comes out of that is, maybe we do need alternatives to these institutions. And to me, what's a little bit ironic in the big historical intellectual sense is, this is kind of like, oh, you know what? Institutions have a real impact on socializing people.
Turns out.
And there aren't these we need to pay attention to institutions as battlegrounds. And, this is no big insight, and we've seen, but it's part of a larger, to my mind, kind of realization or kind of the putting into action politically an intellectual point about the role of institutions and the use of institutions to political ends that is very interesting and a little bit different than what we think of as classic conservative thought.
Yeah. And I think, and I think what you said there really just lays out in some ways, in some ways why this issue has changed. Again, vouchers is moving into this. That's sort of what's so interesting to me about this discussion is the way that, in some ways, as you've been laying out, parental rights and this idea about curriculum, again, they connect with vouchers in an interesting way. But nonetheless, how you mobilize this issue politically, I think is a pretty big challenge.
Well, I think it's
for both sides.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
You laid out sort of the, we're talking about like, basically in some ways, playing to conservative voters. And when I say conservative, I just mean, generally conservative. I'm not even talking about like ideologues here, but playing to conservative voters' sensibilities about, let's say the primacy of, whatever, American exceptionalism, let's put that out there as one thing, and
heteronormativity.
Heteronormativity. We can go down the list. General, but again, but about this sort of
just shoot me now.
But commitment. But let's just say a commitment to an ideological worldview and about the role that education is playing and the continuation of it. Look, that is pretty abstract. And for Democrats too. Just to be fair here, you're sitting here saying no. Listen, our Democratic voters, they are very committed to the public education system. Yeah. They do not want money going to, let's say, to a parochial institution. And you say, what's parochial mean? I guess, whoa, and so
I guess that's what's interesting to me about that's the point. In a way, you're getting at the point I was getting at it in a different way, which is that, I guess what I'm marveling at here a little bit is the very concrete operationalization of the realization that public education institutions, take a deep breath, are basically the means of ideological reproduction, right? So, these things are big fights, and so we're either going to, it's a two-front battle now, if you want to be fair on both sides, right, in which what is taught in the public schools, and not just the content of curriculum, but the cultural norms are worth fighting over. And the two-front battle right now, particularly among conservatives and a lot of conservatives, is we're either going to, at the same time, we're going to try to change what's going on inside the public schools, but we're also going to weaken the institutions and create alternatives to that.
Right.
And, that's to me, that's the game that's afoot right now. And it's a rational strategy from that point of view, at least in the short run. But I think that is the stakes of what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and then I would say, take a step back and kind of sum up, some of that, and put it in, this into the full context here, right? So if you're going to we're kind of getting to the end here, say, so while school safety and the shortage in teachers is going to continue to receive a bunch of attention, and the teacher shortage retention thing could push itself onto the agenda by force at some point, depending on what happens with that, right? But these kind of, I just mean and this was going on. You can imagine if schools can't operate, there's problems, right? But these sort of educational campaign issues of 2022, I think they're going to get higher billing, and there's two reasons for that. Again, where the center of Republican attitudes are on this, which is not with putting more money in the system or tinkering with the financing, but really in these sort of culture war issues, right? And just generally, in some ways, again, acknowledging the indoctrinating effects of the institutions, right? But in some ways, they can probably get, I would say one could probably get away with just addressing those things and not addressing, I would say teacher pay or financing the system, and maybe even not school safety in a terribly extensive way because of all the things we're talking about. Because the things that people who really care about it care, those are the things. And for everybody else, it's kind of abstract. Right. And so that's not, is it gonna supplant border security for Republicans as the top issue?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, not a chance.
And ultimately, unless the bills that the legislature eventually passes having to do with public education just fundamentally offend the vast majority of Democrats, which they will on their face, but also do so in an intense way, which I think seems unlikely.
Right.
then there's still going to be the same range of issues that Democrats are interested in, including education, but also gun safety and also healthcare and also the climate.
I mean, I think as we're talking about this, I mean, I think what's interesting, or one of the things that's interesting about this is that, that's at the intersection of, the internal process and politics of the legislature and public opinion is the context of that. Mm-hmm. And, public opinion sort of filtering in some ways is that it's easy to conceptualize this in the public education space in the way that we've been talking about to some degree. But then there are these other external things that, are bound to enter into it because of the way the legislative process works and the messiness and lack of, sharpness, if you will, in public attitudes, which is if we were just going to have this fight and it was going to be just about the kind of way I've been reducing it about like, okay, what are we doing in the public schools? What is the role of the public school? Who controls the institutions? Who controls like how, what they're doing in their core functions? But there are these other elements that are entering into it, right? The deflection of, or, the desire to demonstrate action on school violence without talking about guns. Right. So all of a sudden, we're talking about increased funding conceivably for school safety and facilities and all of this. Other elements that are part of the larger conversation that are also buffeting this, obviously property taxes.
Yeah, sure.
And so I think it does bring out the way that they're connected in the way that, this is, even if we were just going to think about, okay, we're just going to silo this. This is going to be, this is completely hypothetical, non-realistic, stylized example. But okay, this is going to be the session where, the main priority, no matter what, is going to be public education. Mm-hmm. We are going to sit here and we are going to have a serious, focused conversation that is fact-based and evidence-based and blah, 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 where everybody's time is going to be spent on this. It's a stylized example because all these other things would still be connected
and then you'd say,
to it.
To do what?
Yeah, right.
Right, and that's a big.
Well, but that would be the
big question.
But that would also clarify. That would be the clarifying effect of that stylized, non-realistic example. But it's also why we're not going to have it.
No, but it's great. But I think that stylized, non-realistic example is probably a pretty good way to think about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because when you get to that endpoint and say, well, okay, we're meeting to have this conversation to do what? And is it to fix the way we finance the system? Is it to make it the best system of any of the states, in the country? Is it to deal with the fact, again, that that there's a feeling out there that's pretty widespread that the schools are indoctrinating the students in the wrong kind of way?
Right.
Well, you know what? I think that's going to be the winner.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But that's the point there. If that's the winner, well, then that kind of tells you where we should expect, things to go. And so, one of the things is, I don't like to make predictions, which is terrible. But, there is you think about what do you expect to have happen here. I think there's, if we go down the session and say, where is public education spending its time and resources and energy? I expect a lot of time and resources and energy to be spent in this space.
Yeah, whether it succeeds or not, certainly it's going to be there.
What's interesting, I just want to add one thing about the polling just to go, in the arc of it. But, you mentioned this idea of, the institution is sort of the indoctrinator and all that kind of stuff. And it's funny because, right now there's a sort of...
We could say agent of socialization if we want to be more social sciencey, I guess.
Do what you want to do.
But whatever.
But, it's interesting. We're at a point now where basically the question is, what kind of standards, limits, guardrails is the state going to put on, the ISDs, the many, many ISDs in the schools across the state, right? As it relates to, how students are taught about, especially sensitive topics. What's interesting is when you go back in the polling, in sort of the last decade and think about this discussion, you look at the priorities people, ascribe to education. And what used to be a popular priority for Republican voters was letting the local school districts make basically curriculum decisions. That was a big discussion that was going on for a while about, this happened to do with graduation requirements. They try to localize a lot of graduation requirement, issues. But this was, this ongoing idea of and again, local control always pops its head up in these weird ways. And again, you can't, again, we'll caveat and put aside the discussion of race and all this for, 3 other podcasts some other time. But, that was where the discussion was in some ways, was, well, maybe we should give the districts more control so that they can, deal with their parents and their, norms and that kind of thing. And it didn't really go anywhere, but it's interesting now that, a few years later, you come back and say, no, we should tell everybody exactly what the rules of the road are.
Well, and I would argue, that's a sign of an embrace of, managing institutional control to some degree. But I think, the other thing, I mean, it's funny as you say that. I mean, it kind of underlines the point of just how, abstract it is, to isolate these things. The other thing I was going to throw in there was, something else in the poll that I think, maybe this is putting a pin for, one of the upcoming podcasts, is that the state's growth is not a trivial consideration here, because when you talk about spending, we may be spending the right amount, but if we're spending the right amount per pupil, then we need to increase spending.
Yeah, I mean, I have a note in here that I'll just say it out loud. It's really easy to spend a lot on public education without spending enough.
Yeah,
depending on what your goals are.
Because you have to spend a lot just to keep up with where the state is right now, and that is another. But as soon as you bring that in, it raises a bunch of these questions. The questions about race that you
about
raised,
equity, about
the questions about control, all of these kinds of things. Also, you can't really keep out a bunch of these other contextual
Well, that's a great place
elements.
to end this podcast in some ways, right? Because on the one hand, you've got a push by, really in many ways, an ideological drive to that's really being driven by, in many ways, older, whiter voters, and a public education system that is dominated by non-white young Texans.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that this is, in a lot of ways about woke ideology, and you think about, again, gender identity differences by age group and things like that. I mean, you're just talking, this is why, this can happen this session, but you know what? It's not, we're going to come back to this and again and again and again, because the system and, sort of these things are in a clear collision course with each other. I mean, if not already colliding, right?
Yeah, you don't have to scratch very hard at the construct of woke ideology to get to that point.
Right.
Uncomfortable fact of the situation, I think, for some people. With that, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Texas at Austin. The data we talked about and the blog post archive you can find at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks to Josh for being here and all his work on this. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.